All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to talk about how the properties of our preferences and our choices affect the size of income and substitution effects. And the reason why this is important is because having a better understanding of what assumptions about people's preferences or what observations about people's initial choices will lead to bigger and smaller income and substitution effects will put us in a better position to predict people's responses to new changes in prices or changes in income if they occur. So let's start out back in our food and housing world, right, where we have this big decrease in the price of food. And let's think about what would lead to a bigger or a smaller substitution effect. So what I'm going to say is, we're going to have a smaller substitution effect when our indifference curves are really curvy than we would if our indifference curves were really straight. So this blue indifference curve, right, is fairly curvy. I'm going to draw a red indifference curve through the same original optimal point. But it's not going to be very curvy at all, right? Not nearly as curvy as the blue indifference curve. Now, the reason this is going to lead to different optimal choices, right, is when we go in here and we take our final budget constraint and shift it down, right, we're going to find our substitution point with a much smaller change in consumption on our blue curve than we will on our red curve, right? That's our blue substitution effect. If we do the same thing with our red curve, right, we take our final budget constraint and shift its slope down. Our red substitution effect is going to be much larger, right? So to think about why that is, right, let's think about what it means for our indifference curves to be curvier versus straighter. So fundamentally, right, the curvier our indifference curves are, the more quickly, the more strongly we believe that diversity is better. So if we have goods that are really best consumed together, right, goods that really serve complementary purposes, we're going to end up with very curvy indifference curves. If we have two goods that are effectively interchangeable, we're going to have straighter indifference curves. And the more easily you could substitute food for housing, right, the more interchangeable their jobs are, the more we expect you to react to a change in relative prices. So to see that, why don't we think about the two extreme cases? Let's decompose a change in consumption, right, a substitution effect, when we have perfect complements, which is the curviest you can possibly get your indifference curves, so curvy that our indifference curves turn into right angles, and perfect substitutes, which is the least curvy we can get our indifference curves, right? So uncurvy that they turn into straight lines. Okay, so let's start with perfect complements. So let's take two goods that we generally think of as perfect complements. Let's say bike chains and bike gears. Let's imagine that bike gears go from being really, really, really expensive to being really, really, really cheap, right? And we want to know what is our substitution effect from this change in prices. Okay, sorry, looks like we're back. Right, what's our substitution effect from our change in prices? So, right, what would we do? We would say, what's our original choice? Let's say our original choice is something like this, right? We want to know what would our budget constraint look like, right? What would our hypothetical budget constraint look like that goes through this same original indifference curve, but has the slope of our final budget constraint. So as always, right, we take our final budget constraint, we shift it down, and put a parallel line through our original indifference curve. And in the case of perfect complements, our substitution point is just going to be identical to our original choice. Right, and the reason is, as we've talked about before, right, because of the fact that our MRS is effectively anything between infinity and zero, right, we're not going to trade away gears for any number of chains. You can give me any number of chains you want per gear. I'm not going to give up a single gear when I'm at point O, right? You can give me any number of gears you want. I'm never going to give up a single chain, right? The only way to keep me on that same indifference curve with any price change is to leave me at my original point. So when we have perfect complements, right, 100% of any change is going to be an income effect. right? We would end up at some final point like this. And the only reason that our choices would change is because of the fact that we got richer. Okay, so how about perfect substitutes? Let's say that we had oxybucks and dollars, right? And let's say originally the administration was charging $5 per oxybuck, right? So we have some really, really steep curve like this. So let's say we've got an original, something like 5.0, all right, I'll call oxybucks B for bucks, right? 5B plus D less than or equal to our income, right? And then we have a change so that an oxybuck costs 50 cents. So then our new budget constraint looks something like 1/2 B plus D less than or equal to our income. Some big radical change in our prices, right? And let's imagine that our difference curves, I use a lot of colors here because we've got a bunch of straight lines to deal with, right? So let's say that our utility function is just B plus D, right? So in this case, right, we have an MRS equal to 1. Our original price ratio would be 5/1. So PB over PD equals 5/1. Right, so our original optimal choice is just going to be a vertical corner solution, right? We're not willing to buy any oxybucks at $5 per oxybuck, right? Our original choice is going to be here. Now, what happens when I take my final budget constraint, right, and shift the slope so that I am on my original indifference curve, but with the slope of my final budget constraint? Well, if I take this slope, right, and I move it along, looking for where I'm going to have an MRS equal to my new price ratio, I'm not going to find it anywhere, right, because my MRS is always the same. So the only point, right, my optimal choice, given this new slope, is going to have to be a horizontal corner solution, right? My optimal choice, no matter how much income I have, right, if I have a new price ratio of 1/2 and an MRS of 1, is going to have to be where I'm buying only oxybucks, right? So my substitution point is going to have to be here. I move all the way from a vertical corner to a horizontal corner, right, where my final choice is, of course, going to be here. So what does that mean my substitution effect is? Well, it means if I'm thinking about dollars, my substitution effect is going from spending all my money on dollars to spending none of my money on dollars, right? It's the largest possible substitution effect. And likewise, if I think about my substitution effect in oxybucks, it's going to be the largest possible substitution effect, right? I'm going to substitute away all of my dollars for oxybucks. So, right, so if we think about what this means about the curviness of our indifference curves, if we go from having completely not curved or completely curvy curves, right, when we have perfect complements, to completely not curvy curves, we go from having no substitution effect to having the largest possible substitution effect. Okay, and then how about income effects? What determines the size of my income effect? Well, in this case, there's really going to be two things. The first thing is going to be how much the price change affects my well-being. So first, if price change makes a bigger difference in your well-being, bigger change in wealth, there will be a bigger income effect. So to see that, let's go back to our food and housing example. Right, so we'll say housing and food. Let's have some original budget where food's really expensive and a final budget where food's really cheap, right? So let's imagine that I was spending very, very little of my income on food. So let's say I had an original choice like this, right? If I drew an indifference curve, that would make sense of that choice. maybe like this, right? And then I decompose this into income and substitution effects, right? I pull down my, right, I pull down my new slope to get a substitution point. Let's say that I've got a final choice like this, or really wherever, right? There's going to be a relatively small effect of this price change on my wealth, right? On my well-being, because of the fact that I wasn't spending that much money on food, so getting food a little bit cheaper doesn't make me all that much richer. If you compare that to someone who spends a lot of money on food, right? Let's say a red preference person had an original optimal choice like this, right? If I say, how much richer does that make me feel? Right, they're going to have a much, much bigger expansion in their budget constraint than does blue person. Right, red person basically got this much richer, blue person only got that much richer. And the reason, right, red person is spending a larger share of their income on food than blue person, so a decrease in the price of food has a smaller effect on their well-being, right? It makes blue person less wealthy than it makes red person. So if I change the price of a good that I buy a lot of, I'm going to have a bigger income effect on everything than if I change the price of a good that I only buy a little bit of. Right, so if we're talking about a change in the price of bubblegum, we're probably not going to expect much of an income effect on anybody, right, even Sean Spicer's, because most people don't spend much of their income on bubblegum. If we're talking about a change in the price of housing, we might expect to have a pretty big income effect on most people, because people spend a lot of their income on housing. So that's the first thing, right? The second thing that's going to determine how big our income effect is going to be how much our consumption of the good we're considering depends on income. Right, so this is going to have to do with our preferences, right? As we talked about in last lecture, right, if we're looking at a luxury good, we might expect our consumption to depend a lot on income. Right, if we're thinking about how much caviar we buy, right, or how much avocado toast we buy in the other example, right, we might expect it to depend a lot, right? If our income goes up, we're going to spend a lot more money on caviar. On the other hand, if we're thinking about necessity goods, we might expect that a change in income is going to have a pretty small effect on how much we buy. Right, if I want to know how much dish soap you're going to buy, you might not buy a whole lot more dish soap if you get richer than if you get poorer, right? Because you only need so much, and you're going to buy that much dish soap regardless of your income, right? Or close to that. So if we're going to think in terms of preferences that we know, right? If you think about quasi-linear preferences, once you're in an interior solution, consumption of one of your goods doesn't depend at all on income, right? So that's one extreme case. And likewise, if we're thinking about inferior goods, right? If we think of a good that's strongly inferior, right, the microwavable ramen might be strongly inferior for some people. Consumption of that good is going to depend a lot on income. If we think about a good that's weakly inferior, consumption of that good might not depend that much on income. Right, grocery store brand yogurt, that's really pretty fine. Okay, so our substitution effects, the size is going to depend on how curvy our indifference curves are. Our income effects are going to be larger when we have a big price change on a good that we buy a lot of, and they're going to be larger when our consumption of a good depends a lot on our income, right? So they're going to be larger for luxury goods or strongly inferior goods than they will be for necessity goods or weakly inferior goods. Okay, great. So in the last video, I'm going to talk about a weird case called giffen goods using these concepts, and then I'm going to finish my story about disability insurance.